So, like every Ohioan, I have been absolutely inundated with ads for the Senate race this year. The ads are tedious and constant, but one thing that's been interesting in a horrific sort of way is the absolute transphobia of it all. Here are some examples.
Sherrod Brown backs Biden's extreme agenda. Men and girls sports, sex change surgeries for kids, and
I thought I knew Sherrod Brown, but I didn't know his voting record.
Sherrod voted to let transgender biological men compete in women's sports.
And Brown would allow puberty blockers and even sex change surgery for young kids.
Now, I am not here today to particularly dissect the ad itself or explain how this is transphobic. It's literally the same garbage that J.K. Rowling tweets ad nauseum on Twitter, so if you want an in-depth refutation of these talking points, I'd encourage you to watch the videos J.K. Rowling and The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling by Contrapoints. Rather, I want to talk about the response to the ads that I've seen in the discourse and in my personal life. That response being no response. It is disturbing that the Democratic Party, outside of a handful of vocal advocates, is unwilling to challenge transphobia through its rhetoric when Republicans have made trans discrimination a focal point of theirs. The Democrats like to paint themselves not just as the party of social justice, but as the party for LGBT+ citizens. And yet, when the Republican Party centers attacks on the LGBT+ community, the Democrats refuse to counter. I don't think I've seen a single pro-Sherrod Brown ad that actually advocates for LGBT+ issues. I've seen plenty that talk about working with Trump to close the border throughout the Trump administration.
Sherrod Brown is working to fix our border crisis. Sherrod voted yes with Republicans for the most conservative immigration bill in decades.
But not a single ad has touched LGBT+ rights at all. He does mention supporting LGBT+ rights on his campaign website, but most people are not engaging with the campaign website. They're engaging with the ads shoved down their throat at every moment. So if Brown really wanted to signal to LGBT+ citizens, he'd include their issues in his advertising. And this is true of support and attack ads. Attack ads on Republicans have been prominently featuring abortion rights advocacy for years now, but especially after the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the success of Issue 1 last year. This example comes from the Democratic super PAC Win Senate.
It's about my granddaughter and all the women that I know and love and future generations. Our lives don't belong in Bernie Moreno's hands.
Win Senate is responsible for the content of this ad.
So it's obvious that the Democrats are trying to appeal to the value of medical autonomy with ads like these. So in this context, it's interesting to know that Ohio's legislature passed Bill HB 68 in 2023, which limits gender affirming care for transgender youth. Quote, "It is of grave concern to the General Assembly that the medical community is allowing individuals who experience distress at identifying with their biological sex to be subjects of irreversible and drastic non-genital gender reassignment surgery and irreversible, permanently sterilizing genital gender reassignment surgery, despite the lack of studies showing that the benefits of such extreme interventions outweigh the risks." This is all bunk. The research by and large supports gender-affirming care as best practice for trans individuals. Research by the Stanford School of Medicine shows that providing gender-affirming care for trans youth significantly improves their mental health and life outcomes. Quote, "The new study found that transgender people who began hormone treatment in adolescence had fewer thoughts of suicide, were less likely to experience major mental health disorders, and had fewer problems with substance abuse than those who started hormones in adulthood. The study also documented better mental health among those who received hormones at any age than those who desired but never received the treatment." Other sources say that gender-affirming care does in fact improve trans outcomes, but the social stigma and vilification of trans individuals replaces the stressor of gender dysphoria with external fear of social rejection or violence, especially in school settings. The bill also plans for future limitations and restrictions on trans people's lives, notably in terms of sports. Quote, "Sections 3313.5319 and 3345.562 of the revised code, as enacted by this act, shall be known as the Save Women's Sports Act." As we all saw with the Aman Khalif polemic, fears about how
Transgender biological men compete in women's sports
is a deeply transphobic rhetoric point that often targets cisgender people who diverge from conservative ideals of what a man or a woman is, and ignores the fact that HRT does, in fact, change musculature and athletic performance. Paralympian Valentina Petrillo was the first transgender woman to compete at the Paralympics, and she did not wipe the floor with the other athletes. she got third in the semifinal, losing to cis women despite having undergone male puberty and having transitioned later in life. And if you think for some reason that the results of the Paralympics can't be a valuable case study of trans women in women's sports, I'd invite you to consider that you might be diminishing what it means to be a disabled athlete, just as so many have done for centuries with women's sports. And all of this is not even mentioning how cisgender people, including children, often need access to gender-affirming care themselves for completely cisgender reasons. You would think, then, that HB 68 and plans for the Save Women's Sports Act, now having been shown to be derived from inaccuracies and deeply harmful, could become a reasonable, mainstream point of refutation in Democrat campaigning. But it's not. You would think that if Democrats really cared about access to health care and medical autonomy, as they argue they do when they advocate for abortion access, they'd actually take on and challenge these attacks on gender-affirming care. You'd think that if people didn't want trans women who went through male puberty to participate in women's sports, we'd increase access to gender-affirming care for trans femme youth so that they don't have to go through male puberty in the first place. But the Dems tacitly concede trans rights to Republicans in the discourse. Letting Republicans erode the idea of trans healthcare means they've conceded to Republicans that there are instances where the demands of the state can supersede the medical and bodily autonomy of its subjects, even when such impediment leads to negative life outcomes for the subject. So they really have no argument against the erosion of abortion rights, except for no, stop, don't do that. Trans rights don't seem to have the same importance as abortion rights, even though they both concern the greater question of right to bodily autonomy, and that's concerning to me. But here's the thing. While the Democrats self-style as advocates for marginalized groups, they're really the party of moderates. They're the party that builds bridges between the right and the left, the party of common ground, perhaps the party of reason itself. It's how they've marketed themselves the entire time that I've been paying attention to them, and from what I can tell, it's been that way for a good long while. The Harris campaign trades on this idea, calling itself the biggest coalition of the right and the left, and has garnered support from the fucking Cheneys. The philosophic idea that lies at the root of this move is this. The right and the left, they both have good ideas, but they lack perspective. The best solutions to society's problems need to be approached from both sides, and so the best political party takes the best policy proposals from both sides. I think that there's a fair point here, but this type of thinking is easily used for abuse. To understand this, we need to talk about the Overton window. The Overton window is the spectrum of ideas that are considered reasonable in any given period's political discourse. Now, let's pretend that political ideas could somehow be placed on a clean, linear, 9-point line graph, 1 being the most reactionary and 9 being the most progressive. We'll call this the political spectrum. The points at the end of the political spectrum are considered radical, and ideas that lie beyond those boundaries are unthinkable. However, those that fall in the center are considered reasonable and adopted into policy. This range in the center is the Overton window. A 1-point idea might be something like, a state should only admit people into its borders on the condition that they meet strict genetic and cultural requirements, and a 9-point idea might be that political borders should be abolished outright. A 3-point idea may agree that a state should only accept people from a certain genetic and cultural background, but may accept a higher level of diversity, such as all the genes and cultures indigenous from a particular continent, instead of one select region. A 7-point view may argue that borders should not discriminate against anyone trying to seek citizenship, but agree that political borders should be maintained for administrative reasons. The 5-point view, then, would be something like, some level of genetic and cultural discrimination is necessary for the stability of a nation's border, but discrimination should be as minimal as possible to protect the interests of as many people, including citizen hopefuls, as possible. This might be familiar, as it's the rough idea held as axiom by the Democratic Party. In the Democrats' perfect world, the Overton window would cover points 4 through 6, and it would be the Democrat Party that held it there. The problem is that a 1-point party, lacking a rival 9-point party of equal relevance, can relabel the party of the 5-point moderates as the 9-point party, making a minimum amount of discrimination the most extreme progressive opinion, and now the moderate opinion is the 3-point view, basically calcifying reactionary thought as the only valid form of political thought. The party that wants to market itself to the moderate viewpoint will then necessarily have to adopt more conservative politics to maintain the image of being the moderate party, and that means abandoning significant parts of its constituency for political expediency. Now, the reality is that political ideas are not so one-dimensional as to only be right or left, so this thought experiment is reductive as presented. But the reality is that American politics have reduced themselves to this very one-dimensionality through the two-party system. There are the conservative Republicans and the liberal Democrats, and no other political party has any sort of viability. The ideas that the Republicans and the Democrats promote to their constituencies are the only viable political ideas in the United States, so I don't think this number line model I've presented is completely without merit. All of the attack ads posted by the Senate Leadership Fund end on the tagline, Sherrod Brown, too liberal for Ohio.
Sherrod Brown is just too liberal for Ohio.
Sherrod Brown's bad votes are no joke. He's way too liberal for Ohio.
Sherrod Brown let us down.
The rhetorical point is that the politics and policies that Brown supports are beyond the scope of legitimate consideration. So when those policies are trans positive, they mean to say that trans existence is beyond the scope of legitimate consideration. And this is not just one ad that plays every few days. This has been a months-long campaign with ads playing at least once every ad break, and new transphobic ads being released frequently. On the Senate Leadership Fund's YouTube channel, there are 5 unique attack ads on Brown that center transphobia: Buddy, Nonsense, Protect, Granddad, and Thought. Okay, so after I had finished writing the script and started recording, the Senate Leadership Fund actually published 2 new transphobic ads. One's called Funny, and this newest one that I saw yesterday as I was going to bed is called How Liberal. And it is perhaps the cringiest ad I have ever seen in my life. So let's go ahead and watch that.
Just how liberal could Sherrod Brown be?
Well, he backed bills to allow transgender biological males to compete in girls' sports and let men into girls' locker rooms.
Very liberal.
Brown supported allowing children to receive sex-change surgery.
Super liberal.
Brown even voted to allow late-term partial birth abortions, where the baby is partially delivered alive.
Radical liberal.
Sherrod Brown, way too liberal for Ohio.
Senate Leadership Fund is responsible for the content of this advertising.
Okay, so one last little addendum to this, because it doesn't really have that much to do with the rest of the video, but why does the Senate Leadership Fund seem so obsessed with this video of Sherrod Brown, like, walking in a parking lot? Like, they use it at the end of basically all of their ads, and I do not know why. Like, it's not even him being particularly shady. It just looks like him walking in a parking lot. Is this like footage that's coming from like a video or something of like him avoiding questions? Like, I just don't understand. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get back to the actual subject. They play on YouTube, on cable television, on the radio, basically everywhere where ads play. Brown has begun to trail behind Moreno in the polls after ads supporting Moreno dramatically increased in volume, which is exactly what I noticed the other year with J.D. Vance. It turns out that, according to an article published by Axios.com on October 1st, ad spending on behalf of Moreno has already topped $195 million. This seems like as good a moment as any to say that Bernie Moreno has gotten major financial support from the crypto industry, so maybe store that one somewhere in the back of your noggin. The Ohio senatorial race has been one of the most expensive in terms of ad buys, and a more than significant portion of those ads are peddling transphobia at a dazzling scale. Millions upon millions of dollars are being spent to promote transphobia from Cleveland to Cincinnati in hopes that transphobic values will put a Republican in the Senate. And this isn't even just in Ohio. Senate Leadership Fund ads in Montana are also leaning heavily into transphobia.
John Tester, 2006.
Politicians oftentimes say one thing and do another.
Tester wrote a bill to let men use girls' bathrooms and voted to deny farm aid to white farmers.
They're also appealing to white racists, saying that Tester voted to discriminate against white farmers. Fact checkers say that this is false. This ad also ends with the same "too liberal" tagline.
John Tester didn't change Washington, it changed him.
In my opinion, this is a textbook case study in the political elite shifting the Overton window. Republicans and conservatives have so vilified trans people that the medical autonomy and equal integration into society of binary trans people has become the 9-point idea, and Democrats, in playing to the center, have had to make the choice to sacrifice the trans community's image in hopes of maintaining political power. Again, certain Democrats in certain places have done well to enact trans protections, but it seems that in terms of campaigning, the Democrat mainstream is unwilling to vocally address trans issues beyond gesturing to the entire LGBT+ community as valid during Pride Month and riding on the coattails and clouds of those enterprising Democrat politicians who actually do commit to trans rights. This is a frustration felt by many. In an article on Advocate.com reflecting on the lack of trans advocacy from Harris during the presidential debate, journalist Marie-Adelina de la Ferrière writes, "I'm not questioning whether Kamala Harris is an ally to the community. Her record as Attorney General, U.S. Senator, and Vice President has proven her pro-LGBTQ+ stance. However, allyship is more than just showing folks waving pride flags in campaign ads and rallying prominent LGBTQ+ activists and personalities to join the campaign to defeat Trump. True allyship is about speaking up when folks are not in the room, let alone have a seat at the table. It's about defending the voiceless, protecting their dignity, and never backing down when the pressure is up. By refusing to address these issues at a pivotal moment, Harris caves into her opponent's "don't say trans" rhetoric, despite so many transgender Americans trying to live and thrive in this country. The silence is deafening, and the Harris-Walz ticket must take a vocal stance on the matter. Unfortunately, I just don't think that Harris is going to make it a part of her campaign. I mean, it's a little late now anyways, but to go beyond waving pride flags would be to lose center and risk losing voters who are off-put by radical ideas. Again, the radical idea here being that trans people should have full bodily autonomy, unrestricted access to medical care, and the opportunity to live freely and openly in communities as equals to their cisgender peers. This is also why the Democrat establishment has continued to advocate for climate-destructive energy sources, even as weather events like Helene and Milton become stronger and more frequent due to climate change. Harris has recently doubled down on pro-fracking stances, saying she believes fracking is compatible with a clean energy economy.
Let me be absolutely clear, as I've been when I said it back in 2020. I will not ban fracking. I did not as vice president. In fact, I cast the tie-breaking vote to open up more fracking leases. And my perspective on this is grounded in a number of things, including that we don't have to ban fracking to do the work that we can do to also invest in a clean energy economy. So that's where I stand, period.
Fracking, as we all know, is a grievously damaging process which pollutes water, emits the greenhouse gas methane into the atmosphere, and increases seismic activity in its surrounding areas. So just because the natural gas it produces burns cleaner than oil or coal, it cannot be said to be compatible with a clean energy economy. This comes in the context of criticism of the Harris-Walz campaign for being conspicuously silent on climate-related matters this summer, or at least until Helene forced it into the fore. Democrats define themselves in the negative, against the radical, standing for nothing in particular but the vibe of what feels reasonable to a hypothetical everyman. Republicans do not behave this way. They have values. No immigrants, no blacks, no abortion, no trans people, and they fight for those values. Trans people and their basic human rights are currently too radical to be a valuable campaigning issue to the Democrat elite, so they just ignore them. What's worse is that a large portion of the LGBT+ community seems unwilling to challenge transphobia in the media. Across the pond, the LGBT+ news outlet Pink News recently came under boycott by the trans community and its allies after an audio leak was released in which CEO Benjamin Cohen allegedly seeks to distance the brand Pink News from trans issues, calling them contentious and implying they harm relationships with advertisers. Here is the alleged audio.
things that relate to trans and non-binary remain incredibly contentious. I think that the marriage, the idea, and we're celebrating 10 years of same-sex marriage this year, I think that the society has moved on and it has been generally accepted. And while, yes, when we were doing it, it was contentious, I think that the other things are even more contentious than that was then, and are significantly contentious now, and there is significant brand and partner nervousness around that topic. And so, in my view, they are different things. I think that we just have to be careful, and it's like, that's for others to do. And also the business can't afford to do that. It's the role of others to seek to change narratives. If we start doing too many things, I think it will harm the conversations with advertisers for other things, because it gives the perception that Pink News is something different to it is. What we are is an entertainment content powerhouse. We don't want to be positioning ourselves as some sort of like charity.
Now, the posts of the original leak have been lost due to Pink News taking legal action against the whistleblower, but a Reddit post on r/transgenderuk by user noparty7944 gives some context for the leak audio. Firstly, I want to dispel some misinformation that's been talking about, because as much as you have a right to hate Pink News right now, trust me, I'm there with you. It's best to do it accurately. The recording published by the Pink News Whistleblowers account, in which the CEO Benjamin Cohen says trans rights are too contentious, was recorded during a 2023 meeting about the idea of running a political campaign in the general election. He was wrong to say it. He should be criticized, but he did not say that trans coverage was ending on the website or social media. Quite frankly, he doesn't get a say in that. A lot of the discussion online has made claims about Pink News wanting to stop covering trans stories, which is demonstrably incorrect, but I don't think that Pink News is quite off the hook either. If No Party's post is correct, and the audio is dismissing the idea of running a political campaign for trans issues, then that's a serious problem, because such a campaign for contentious LGBT+ rights has precedent in Pink News' history. In 2009, Pink News was at the heart of a pressure campaign on Ben Summerskill, the CEO of Stonewall UK, a British LGBT+ advocacy organization. Back in this period, it was not trans healthcare at the center of anti-LGBT+ rhetoric, but gay marriage, and Stonewall, despite being an LGBT+ organization, refused to openly support policy proposals for gay marriage. Jessica Geen writes about an interview with Summerskill, stating, "Another criticism often leveled at the organization is its acceptance of civil partnerships as opposed to marriage, something some critics have described as sexual apartheid." To which Summerskill replied, "Well, the issue on marriage is that, again, there are a lot of vocal supporters, but the thing they've always focused on is actually the real rights and entitlements. As I said, we know there are quite a lot of gay and lesbian people who wouldn't want marriage, and some have explicitly said so. We're one of many, many organizations, but at the end of the day, in terms of our priorities, what we've always focused on is absolutely practical, hard outcomes which make a real difference to people's lives. The reality is, half the population already calls civil partnerships marriage anyway." This is a pretty cowardly opinion. Saying, "some people don't even want rights in the first place," is never a good argument, so long as even one person does. As Michael Cashman, Labour politician and co-founder of Stonewall, said in a Pink News article on September 27, 2010, "Some members of the LGBT community argue that marriage is an outdated, oppressive, and possibly sexist civil institution. Some lesbian and gay people say they're proud of choosing not to marry, but they couldn't possibly be more wrong. They did not choose. I, for one, won't dissolve my civil partnership for a marriage. It's just not for my partner and me. But as a politician who's worked on equality issues for over 20 years, I'm committed to giving this choice to those who do want equality in both facts and in name. Those against same-sex marriage will see their arguments reinforced by choosing not to marry once they actually have that choice." Obviously, gay marriage advocates were not persuaded by Summerskill's line of reasoning, so they kept pushing. Pink News continued to publish articles, seemingly mostly written by Jessica Geen and peaking in September 2010, highlighting Summerskill's refusal to allow Stonewall to advocate for gay marriage. In these other pieces, Summerskill shifts the goalpost, now saying that the group's refusal to commit to gay marriage was strategic, as without consensus on the issue from the major parties, proposals could be undermined. The Cashman article I already quoted also argues against this, stating, "We're witnessing a major shift in public and political opinion. The Labour Party conference is currently considering a motion, which I support, to open up marriage to all couples, and Ed Miliband has already expressed his strong support for same-sex marriage. Liberal Democrat leaders in party have started officially backing same-sex marriage. So does the Green Party, and senior Tories have drawn inspiration from the legacy of New Labour and suggested their party could or should consider same-sex marriage." The policy already had a good amount of support, so what was Summerskill really waiting on? Well, apparently he ran out of good excuses, and with mounting pressure, finally caved, with Stonewall announcing the incorporation of gay marriage advocacy into its lobbying a month later. So Pink News has participated in targeted media campaigns to promote policy in regards to gay marriage, even when there was a perception of gay marriage being a contentious issue. They used their platform as an LGBT+ focused publication to bring national attention to Stonewall's shortcomings, turning the screws on Summerskill by publicly questioning his refusal to support gay marriage and challenging his place of authority as CEO of an LGBT+ lobbying group. Now, it's impossible to say if the campaign was the sole reason for Stonewall's stance reversal, but it seems pretty clear that it was a significant reason for it. Who knows how long Summerskill would have sat on his hands, waiting for consensus, if Pink News didn't put some pressure on him. I mean, it still took until 2013 for the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act to be legalized in the UK, so it's not like Pink News getting Stonewall to support gay marriage was the decisive blow. And I'm not an expert on British civics, nor on British LGBT+ history, so I can't tell you how influential Stonewall was in winning marriage rights. But I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that the endorsement of the largest LGBT+ charity in the UK had no effect. Pink News used its platform to influence not just the direction of politics, but the direction of LGBT+ history itself. So if the alleged audio is legitimate, why would Cohen dismiss the idea of campaigning for trans issues when campaigning for contentious LGBT+ issues is what built Pink News? Well, I think I found the answer. In a Guardian article from 2013, Cohen reflects on Pink News' involvement with the campaign for gay marriage. After citing a Pink News poll that was used as data during the Labour leadership contest, showing the large support of gay marriage as policy proposal, Cohen says the following: "It was only then that our largest gay rights charity said it would campaign for something all three party leaders had already said they would introduce. However, far from being a negative, I feel Stonewall's slowness to move was a positive thing. By remaining silent on this issue, Stonewall ensured that Cameron and Clegg adopted the cause of equal marriage because they wanted to, not because they were placed under any pressure to do so." This quote, to me at least, shows that Cohen is sympathetic to Summerskill's strategy of shoring up consensus in regards to LGBT+ issues. Now, I don't want to say that consensus is not important. You kind of need to have consensus in a democracy, or else it stops being a, democracy. But here's the thing. An LGBT+ organization does not need to have the consensus of the general public nor the political elite to advocate for LGBT+ rights and issues. Let me rephrase. The LGBT+ community does not need permission from the cis-het majority to affirm its values, stake a claim, and demand equal recognition from the rest of society. In fact, if an LGBT+ organization does want to build consensus on LGBT+ issues, if it does want recognition from society, it should be the first one to put forward those ideas and advocate for them in marketing and campaigning. You cannot change public opinion in your favor if you don't state your opinion to the public. Be the change you want to see in the world, An LGBT+ organization that waits for gay marriage to have full support before it begins to advocate for gay marriage fundamentally misunderstands how discourse and advocacy work in the first place. Another place that Cohen and Summerskill seem to agree, at least if the audio is legitimate, is trans issues. Specifically, whose responsibility it is to advocate for them. In that 2009 interview, Geen explains, he also disagreed with the view that Stonewall should represent trans people, saying that for many charities, it was simply a case of popping the T onto LGB, rather than actually working for trans rights. He said, "We are committed to doing stuff as professionally as we can. There are some really complex issues, like medicalization, that quite often people in gay organizations have no idea about. And we do think those issues are important enough to be supported and funded separately, and we've helped to develop and deliver a number of income streams to help. Like when the Department of Health said they wanted to fund some research into gay and trans people's health, we warned that that's not actually good enough. Those are two very different areas." Now, it is true that trans healthcare and gay healthcare are not the same thing, and there are specificities to each that are not reflected in the other. I can easily see how it would be advantageous to have studies that focused on healthcare for each without reducing trans and gay healthcare into one general queer healthcare category, and in fact, I agree that it is necessary to do so. However, it does not stand that Stonewall could not be the one to advocate specifically for trans healthcare. You can do two things at once, actually. It's not that hard. The best course of action would have been for Stonewall's gay leadership to better educate themselves on trans issues and take on trans advocacy, helping to secure research funding specifically designated for trans healthcare rather than just saying, "IDK that much about trans people," and passing on the hot potato to somebody else. That's what solidarity is, and if an LGBT plus organization should have one thing, it's solidarity. This is once again an example of playing to the center. Summerskill, until October of 2010, believed gay marriage was still too contentious, too radical,
way too liberal,
an idea to vocally support. He was simply more concerned with offending the sensibilities of conservative actors than using his platform to advocate for the real issues his own community sought to resolve, looking for any excuse to avoid taking a stance on the issue against the interests of those he claimed to serve. Reading these articles, it doesn't seem to cross his mind that perhaps Stonewall could have been the voice of reason that brought these varying parties into agreement. I think it's just buck wild that the founder of an organization supposedly dedicated to the task of securing LGBT plus rights, which grew to have enough power to be involved with any of these talks at all, would just cede the power it does have to its detractors. Why? What was the point of getting this close to power if you're not going to use it? If you're going to wait for permission from your very detractors to use it. It's an approach to LGBT plus advocacy that defines itself in the negative, against the radical, with no particular values save for those already vocally agreed upon by the majority of people, whether or not the majority of people have good intentions in regards to LGBT plus rights. Because it has no values, because it can only exist in the context of its detractors, it is always stuck playing second chair to them. It's literally Nietzsche's slave morality, right? It's a style of thought based on saying no to another. Because its subjectivity is defined by saying no to an external object, it cannot exist independently of said external object, making it a slave to the object. A master morality, in contrast, derives itself by saying yes to its own subjectivity, making it able to stand on its own. In the case of the LGBT plus community, so many of us focus on saying no to the homophobes. We're not perverts, we're not diseased, we're not broken. This is a natural response, and I don't think it's a completely unhelpful one either. It's important to dispel misinformation, and to do that one must refute it. However, making "I am not" statements the majority of your contribution to the discourse doesn't give you much opportunity to actually affirm what you are. We should be telling them who we are and what we demand. In the case of Summerskill, his train of thought was probably something more along the lines of, "We're not shit starters." But sometimes we need to be shit starters, because if shit don't start, shit won't get done. I mean, how in the hell can you possibly name yourself after the literal Stonewall riots and yet be so afraid to be a shit starter? Well, it's because slave morality is the basis of respectability politics, defining yourself by what you think your detractor will hate the least, and it's perhaps the most common form of conservative thought among LGBT plus people. In my personal, anecdotal experience, it's especially present among gay men. So to me, it makes perfect sense that this is the approach to LGBT plus advocacy that Cohen feels was a positive thing in his Guardian article. Also, in regards to slave morality, I just have to say that the person who ascribes to it is possibly the worst person to try and build solidarity with. You see, because they are unable to affirm their own subjectivity, because they cannot exist independently of their detractor, that means when push comes to shove, they must side with their detractor or face an existential crisis. They cannot align themselves with anyone else, even when their interests actually do align. I mean, how can you stand for another, with another, if you can't even stand for yourself? They are a slave to their master and will serve the master's interests, obeying their every command to the bitter end. If a slave wants to find solidarity with its counterparts, with its equals, it must first be able to put its own interests ahead of its master's. In other words, it must become its own master. So, with all this in mind, whether or not the audio is legitimate, it remains deeply disappointing, yet not at all surprising, that Pink News has not involved itself in trans rights politics as it did with gay marriage. I don't think you really needed a whistleblower to see that Pink News is simply not showing up for trans rights in the same way that they did for gay marriage in the aughts and 2010s. Of course, Pink News has continued to report on the increasing legislation against trans people, which is good, but there's a marked difference in strategy when compared to the publication's early work. Articles talk about different anti-trans legislations, but the publication doesn't put itself in the politics of that legislation, it just reports on it. Pink News obviously has the capacity to put pressure on people in power to respect trans rights and bolster trans healthcare as it did for gay marriage, but it's choosing not to. It really could be a serious LGBT plus publication that uses the journalism industry to advance LGBT plus causes among a massive, international audience who is desperately hungry to see a champion for their rights. It could use its brand recognition as a leading LGBT plus media outlet to be at the forefront of the media's trans narrative, directly challenging many of the thought leaders and politicians who are impeding trans liberation, as they did with Summerskill and gay marriage. They could do all of that, but they don't. They don't because they're a tabloid.
An entertainment content powerhouse.
They're a tabloid that markets itself to the most conservative and docile factions of the LGBT plus community, those trapped in the throes of slave morality and respectability politics. They're playing to the center, and whether that's because they don't want to scare off advertisers, because the publication is run by valueless cowards, a combination of the two, or some other third thing, I'm unable to say. I will say this, however. Cohen's piece for The Guardian ends on the following lines. Pink News' campaign was a real demonstration of the power of the internet to bring the electorate and the political elite together. I believe that's why we'll never need candlelit vigils for gay rights in this country. We have a way of reaching out to politicians that they can't ignore. The cause of gay rights is immeasurably better off for it. Are you still sure about that one, Ben? But on a personal note, the reason why I wanted to talk about all of this is because so many people I personally know are unwilling to publicly challenge transphobia. I've tried to use my personal Facebook page to start conversations about anti-trans rhetoric in these ads, and almost nobody engages. I could count the number of people who do engage on one hand, and it's always the same ones. I got a few comments when I shared a post about the notation software Finale getting shut down, but the same cannot be said for the posts I make about transphobia in the media. You're telling me that a shitty notation software from the 90s getting discontinued is somehow a more engaging conversation point than the unending assault on trans rights by conservative politicians? Really? The most I've seen in terms of trans support in online discourse from my Facebook friends was during the Khalif debacle, and that was mostly just sharing posts saying that the transphobes were technically wrong because Khalif wasn't even a trans woman. Or rather, that Khalif was a biological woman. Barely anybody dared to make the argument that trans women actually do have a place in women's sports, biological or not. It seems to me that, by and large, trans rights are shifting further and further out of the bounds of what people are willing to talk about. Now, I guess this could just be the result of Facebook's algorithm hiding negative content about trans people and other sensitive topics in favor of content farms and stupid memes, but I don't think that's entirely to blame. This refusal to discuss trans issues is also reflected in interactions I've had in real life. I've been so fortunate to get involved with the LGBT+ community in my region over the past few years, and while I've greatly appreciated making these connections to the community, especially with queer people of older generations, I have become pretty dismayed at the many responses I get when I try to talk about trans issues in these spaces. So many times when I'm in conversations with other queer people, mostly queer bisexuality, and I bring up trans rights, the atmosphere chills. The conversation sputters and stalls as my interlocutor gives a depreciatory remark of, "It's awful," or "I just can't even think about it," as their eyes dart around the room looking for any opportunity to change the subject. I remember it so clearly. I was talking to another cis gay man that I was close with one time last year about how I was worried about the increasingly violent escalations against trans rights, and how I thought it had grave implications on gay rights, to which he said, "A majority of Americans are in favor of gay marriage." 1. A majority of Americans are in support of abortion rights, and yet those were still overturned by our conservative majority Supreme Court. 2. Americans supporting gay rights isn't really helping trans people right now, as is demonstrable in the passing of transphobic legislation such as HB 68. So seriously, what could this interjection stand to do except minimize trans issues and distance them from gay issues? Another conversation later revealed to me that he was, in fact, a devout disciple of respectability politics. So looking back on it, that comment makes a lot more sense. It's so frustrating because I really thought that if I finally started to get involved with the LGBT+ community in the area, I could find those others who are hungry for change and want to make the world a more inclusive place. I just assumed that the LGBT+ community already understood the importance of solidarity, and that with the success of Ogre Bafel v. Hodge, the community would use the momentum to earn serious wins in trans acceptance. I was wrong. I guess I was naive. When you grow up a baby gay in a deeply conservative town during the time when the fight for gay marriage was the hot-button issue for the LGBT+ community, and you see decades of activism and advocacy finally pay off, you really get it in your head that, with enough effort, the community can really achieve its goals. Unfortunately, when you're so young, you don't realize that for many people, gay marriage passing in Western countries was the final task. They got what they wanted, and now they're done. On one level, I can understand why that might be the case. Being the target of conservative, discriminatory politics and endless media defamation is exhausting, and we all dream of one day just having a break from it all. Well, the US gays got their break with Obergefell v. Hodge, the UK ones got it with the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act, so they're gonna take it. But while they're off chilling in the break room, trans people are being pulled over the counter and punched out by the media and conservative politicians, and the gays hear all this racket in the lobby and say under their breath, "That is not my job." Through tacit concession to far-right rhetoric by the Democrat elite and their progressive constituency, even by some in the LGBT+ community, transgender citizens in Ohio have become the political scapegoat, alongside Springfield's Haitians, of course. Everyone keeps talking about how the 2024 election is the most important election in US history, and it's true. The world feels like it's collapsing. Abortion rights are under threat, xenophobic racism has once again reached fever pitch, the catastrophes of global heating, like this current hurricane season, are becoming more frequent and more damaging.
I cast the tie-breaking vote to open up more fracking leases.
The economic hardships caused by the climate collapse are worsening. We've all had to watch Palestinians be brutalized over the past year in real time, with the conflict now escalating into a war with Lebanon. Quite literally, nothing is going right. We need as many people on our side if we're going to save the world, but Republicans have so destroyed trans people's reputation that they've become an impediment to securing the vote. Therefore, if we don't defend them, we won't alienate the transphobic vote. We are sacrificing their rights and public image to the God of American democracy, so that perhaps he may look down upon us in good favor and we can win the swing states. But this won't work. There is no God of American democracy, and he doesn't care about your sacrifice. All you're doing is letting Republicans slay our trans and non-binary cousins and getting your hands bloody when you hand them the blade. And do we really want to live on this putrid rock in a climate hell with a forever war in the Middle East, extreme wealth disparity, restricted medical autonomy, and gender policing under constant surveillance by private and state entities? This cannot stand. But credit where credit is due. At least the Dems have not found it politically expedient to completely throw trans people under the bus, as they have with immigrants. So many pro-Sherrod Brown ads appeal to the same xenophobic ideals that Moreno's ads do.
Moreno's powerful Colombian family funneled our money to Latin American banks for so-called development projects.
I much prefer the silence on trans issues to this. But how long until the Dems start trading on reasonable transphobia? Time will tell, I guess. So today is October 19th, and it is around 3:45 when I'm recording this. So yesterday, I saw the first ad from Brown's campaign that actually addresses the transphobia coming out of Moreno's camp. Here it is in its entirety.
Biological men?
What if I told you all of this was a lie, a complete lie, and Bernie Moreno knows it? The truth is, in Ohio, this has already been banned. And Sherrod Brown agrees with Governor DeWine. These decisions should be made by local sports leagues, not politicians.
We can verify the claim that Brown voted to let transgender biological men participate in women's sports is false.
I'm sure Brown and I approve this message.
So this ad sucks. It sucks ass. It's very vindicating, but in the ass-sucking way. The first problem is that it's a disavowal of the support for trans rights. The biggest idea that this ad is trying to convey is that the Senate Leadership Fund ads claiming that Brown has supported all of these trans-positive measures are lies, which is a problem because he should be voting to enact trans protections. That he wants to market himself on his failure to stand for trans rights is damning. Furthermore, this idea they bring up that it should be communities, not politicians, that decide whether or not they are going to discriminate against trans people is absurd. It's a similar argument to the one they use for abortion, and I think it works for abortion, but it absolutely does not work with trans issues. Individual towns and communities do not have the right to decide whether or not they are going to adhere to Title IX non-discrimination laws. If an organization, such as a sports league, receives federal funding, say in the form of a grant, then they do not have the right to discriminate against someone on the basis of their sex and gender identity. Republicans are trying to change that, of course, but we cannot let them. Imagine if we made exceptions for other minorities, right? Like, imagine if we said that communities should have the right to decide whether or not they were going to desegregate their schools. Absolutely not. The United States is not a collection of independent city-states that can do whatever the hell they want. The reason we have state and federal governments is to maintain and enforce a consistency in law that applies to every city and every citizen, and that includes anti-discrimination laws. Politicians absolutely should be the ones to enforce trans protections, so Brown's campaign trying to offload that responsibility onto individual communities and just hope that they choose to abide by Title IX is ridiculous. And I just have to say that as his constituent who has voted for him in the past with the idea that he would promote pro-LGBT plus policies, I'm not sure what Sherrod Brown is doing earns my vote. I'm still going to vote for him because failure to stop trans discrimination is still less malignant than actively advocating for more trans discrimination like Moreno does. Plus, he seems like he's pretty okay with workers' rights. So I encourage you all to vote for Brown as well, at least if you're living in Ohio. Just keep in mind that when re-elected, we need to hold Brown to account and demand that he does more in terms of trans protections, because him being neutral on it is literally not what we're electing him to do. So to round this all out, I'm going to leave some suggestions for things that we as cis people can do to be better allies to the trans community. First thing, reach out to trans friends and acquaintances to do wellness checks. Make sure that they're doing okay, especially if they're living in a trans-negative state. What's more, if you have any questions about trans issues or experiences, a trans friend is a great resource to learn more about their experience. I mean, don't be rude about it, but asking them to talk about their experiences as a trans person in a non-judgmental, safe environment is possible and can really help the trans friend feel more supported. Next, if you don't have any trans friends, well, maybe try to make a few. But if that's not possible for whatever reason, I'm leaving some links in the description to videos that I found very helpful in my path to better understand trans experiences and to become a better ally. Furthermore, if you're someone who is generally progressive and you've begun to internalize the transphobic rhetoric of these ads, I think that these videos will be helpful for you to unlearn some of these harmful messages. Finally, if you are a cis person who does understand the importance of trans liberation and wants to help the trans community, please speak out. Don't let transphobia go unchallenged in your life. And look, you don't need to be confrontational or aggressive about it. I know a lot of us are generally non-confrontational people, and so we tend to let things slide as to not rock the boat, but there are ways to casually challenge transphobia. For example, one time I was on break at a job I was working when a coworker came up to me and, unprompted, told me a transphobic joke. After he said his punchline, I just looked back at him with the most neutral, disinterested look that I could, and he had to sit with the fact that his joke sucked. It's things like that, you know? Don't laugh at transphobic jokes just because you don't want to offend the transphobic jokester. Don't let people walk around dead-naming and misgendering trans acquaintances who have publicly transitioned. Don't let Senate Leadership Fund ads play on the bar's TV without booing them. You know, maybe turn that into a drinking game. Or don't. It does sound like a good way to kill your liver. There are ways that we can push back on the Overton window. There are ways we can make trans rights a part of the reasonable realm of discussion again. We just have to speak up. So speak up.